Friends, followers, YouTubers, lend me your earbuds. Finn here, coming to you from downtown Montreal on January 28th, 2018, with Writing Update number 1. My writing updates, which begin here and now, will make up a series of videos uploaded to my channel on a monthly basis, wherein I talk about my 9 fantasy novels, which are all at various stages of development, and deliver to you a progress report, share some highlights, and generally get down and nerdy with things like syntax, etymology, and grammar. If you're the kind of person who likes books, and fantasy books in particular, then I invite you to settle in for some good shop talk. I also upload other types of videos to my channel, including writing tips, monthly adventure videos, and some monovlogs. This being my first writing update, I'm going to start off by giving you a basic rundown of my timeline. I won't be going into too much detail in regards to my 9 books because that would be what we in the industry like to call an info dump, but I am going to introduce you to the 3 principal books that are at the forefront of my game plan. More on that later. I've been writing creatively since a very early age, and it was easy for my teachers and my family members to see that not only was I passionate about it, but I had a talent for it as well. When I was in grade 6, my teacher assigned the class a simple 1-page Halloween story, and I remember I came back with 13. I wrote my first novel when I was in high school, inspired mainly by the somewhat sophomoric fantasy novels that I was completely engrossed in at the time. I had no idea what I was doing with that book, and I can only remember bits and pieces of it now, since I no longer have the manuscript in my possession. I have no idea what happened to it after I left school and hit the road, and to be honest, it's better off lost than found. I was lucky in that I got a lot of the bad writing out of my system early on in my career, and then I was able to move on to creating better quality literature. When I was 18, I started writing a few short stories to submit to some writing contests in the hopes of winning fame and fortune, or at least a fat cash prize and a modicum of recognition. Alas, I was never so lucky. One day, as I was working on one of these short stories, it suddenly informed me that it didn't want to be a short story anymore. "Well, if you don't want to be a short story," said I, "what do you want to be, a tall tale?" The story thought about this for a moment, paying no mind to my little joke. Then, with a look of utter determination, it said, "I think I'm going to grow up to be a novel." "Okay," I said, with easy complicity, "where do we begin?" "Where does any good storyteller begin?" asked the story in turn, rolling its eyes. "At the end." This might sound a bit odd to you unless you're a writer. Readers generally start at the beginning, but writers start at the end. Otherwise, how do you know where you're going? That was the mistake that I made with that first novel that I started back in high school. I was really just flying by the seat of my pants, or pantsing it, as we say in the industry. And while that can be a lot of fun when you're writing, it can also lead to a lot of issues. This time I made sure that I knew what the plan was before I set out. That short story then became my first novel of real worth, which is entitled Last Night. Here's the front cover. Last Night is a dark urban fantasy that took me 5 years to complete. Once it was done, I started shopping it around, trying to find a publisher, trying to get an agent, trying to get it into the hands of anybody who could help me get it published. As it turned out, I failed, and not for the first time, to attract the right kind of attention in the publishing industry. Eventually, I came to realize that Last Night is a hard sell. It's too long, too dark, and arguably too sophisticated for a first-time aspiring author to be pitching. As most writers do, I had been idly developing some story ideas on the side. And so I had previously laid out the broad strokes for a high fantasy novel, which would be a straight-up quest. It would just be 2 adventurers venturing into strange and magical lands. I had loosely gathered a bunch of story elements that I wanted to include, and at one point I had even tried to write the opening chapters. I didn't get very far with it, however, because by that time, Last Night had already spawned a couple of sequels. I decided to give it some serious thought once I realized that it might be a worthwhile venture to develop this high fantasy adventure story as my breakout novel. I didn't want to lose too much time over it, however, so I asked myself how quickly could I produce such a work. I told myself that if I could write 10 pages a day for 10 days straight, then I could have a fresh new novel in just 10 days. It was an experiment that I'd never tried before, and I'm happy to say that it was a resounding success. I was able to write my high fantasy novel in just under 2 weeks, in a blaze of wit and rum, and I called it The Sylvan Song. I've written several books since then, but I've never been able to really recapture the magic and fervor of when I wrote The Sylvan Song. I'm immensely proud of that book, and to this day I still think that The Sylvan Song is my strongest work. For that reason, it's going to be my flagship, the book that I really push the hardest on the markets whenever I launch it this year, and hopefully it'll blaze the trail for all of the ones that will follow. After I wrote The Sylvan Song, I started to once again contact publishers and agents who were open to submissions. Yet, I was once more frustrated by failure, and received, for my efforts, only stock rejection letters. It was at this time that I started to seriously consider self-publishing. It wasn't the first time that the idea of self-publishing had occurred to me, as I had in the past even gone so far as to seriously consider starting my own small press, which I would call Buggy Horse Books. Here's the logo. I love the visual pun of the buggy horse, and I love thinking about what kind of places the buggy horse is going to take us to. While I never started my small press, I did find a use for Buggy Horse Books as my brand when I realized that I needed it in order to promote my 3 fantasy trilogies. The same thing that happened with Last Night also happened with The Sylvan Song, in that it was meant to be a standalone novel, but it ended up spawning 2 sequels as well. I'm not really sure why this is. I seem to be incapable of writing just a single standalone novel. It always ends up becoming a trilogy. This has happened to me 3 times now, and I'm not really sure why. It's like having triplets 3 times in a row, and you're like, whoa, what the hell, wasn't expecting that. Equally, I seem to be not really inspired to write series that are 8 or 9 novels, or open-ended. I guess for me, it's just a ménage à trois. Or as we like to say here in Montreal, le threesome. This brings me to my 3rd trilogy and the last book that I want to talk about, The Far Country. Once again, here's the cover. The Far Country pretty much came out of left field and rode in on the coattails of The Sylvan Song. Both of these books are closely related in theme and content, even though they take place in completely different worlds and are written in different styles. I think that I was just on such a high after writing The Sylvan Song that my creative impulses allowed me to just jump into this new project. Even though it's masquerading as science fiction, at its heart The Far Country is a fantasy story. It has an odd blend of settings that bleed into magical realism and spiritualism. The 2 sequels are set within the same universe, but they're only loosely connected. And together they create a sort of galactic almanac of major events. The 3rd volume in this trilogy is what I'm currently working on. It's a story about gay space cowboys. And I'm right in the middle of the first draft, hoping to be able to get back to those boys someday soon. Once that story is done, it will be my 9th and final novel. I have elected to stop writing novels after this for a number of reasons, chief among them so that I can finalize and start promoting the books that I already have. The Far Country, for example, still exists in its first draft mode, and one of my major goals is to start revising it and get it ready to send to an editor. Honestly, to date, I haven't been very lucky when it comes to getting published, but I've taken that in stride. I remember when I was just at the beginning of my writing career, I met an older gentleman at a cocktail party, and when he asked about my astrological sign, he said, "Ah, you will succeed late in life." When I said, "How do you know that?" he said, "You're a Capricorn, you're the goat, you have a mountain to climb." At the time, I didn't put much stock in astrology, nor was I one to shy away from butting heads, so I stubbornly refuted him, telling him that I would be published by the age of 25. Well, that wasn't in the stars for me. And since that time, I've come to see this man's wisdom, and I've come to accept the fact that I must play the long game. I started writing Last Night in 1998 when I was 18. Now, 20 years later, as I am about to finish my last book, I can see that while I haven't been very lucky getting published, I have been immensely prolific in that span of time. And that should also be celebrated. What I truly love to do after all is to write, so that's what I've been doing, amassing a wealth of material. It's going to be interesting to see how I fare once I set that aside and no longer have creative writing as an aspect of my daily life. But the time has come for me to stop being the introverted writer and to become the extroverted spokesman, whose primary purpose is to start promoting all of the material that I've written. That's why I'm starting my vlog here on YouTube, to which I will be uploading on a weekly basis. I don't mind exercising patience. I can wait for my starship to come in. Maybe success will only come late in life for me, but that doesn't mean that I'm not going to do everything that I can in my power to precipitate it. My goal is to launch and promote the first 3 novels of these 3 trilogies, Last Night, The Sylvan Song, and The Far Country. Together, these 3 books form what I call my Trinity, and they will be spearheaded by the best of the 3, The Sylvan Song. Let's take a quick look at my timeline so I can break it down for you. Making this little animation ended up doubling the amount of time it took me to complete this first writing update video. I think it was worth it though, since I plan to have a timeline review segment in all future writing updates, hence the parts that are filtered out that will be revealed later on. So that's it for writing update number 1. I hope that you found it interesting, entertaining, exciting, inspiring, informative, all of the above. In future update videos, I will be expounding a bit more on my 3 separate trilogies, as well as exploring the individual novels. If you don't want to miss any future updates, why don't you go ahead and subscribe to my channel. You can also check out my author's site. The link can be found in the description below. When I got to this point in post-production, I realized that I had forgotten to record my little sign-off clip. So instead of abruptly ending my video here, I thought I'd treat those of you who've made it this far to a look at some of the other mistakes that I've made as a novice vlogger.
This being my first writing update, I'm not going to wherein I talk about my 9 fantasy novels inspired mainly by the somewhat sophomoric fantasy novels that I was completely let's try that again. And I can only remember bits and pieces of it now. Bits and pieces of it. Bits and pieces. Meh. I wrote my first novel when I was in high school, inspired mainly, since I no longer have that manuscript in my possession. Oh. I wrote my first novel in high school, mainly inspired mainly. I had no idea what I was doing. When I was 18, I started writing a few short stories to submit to some writing contests, in the hopes of winning fame and fortune. Or at least a fat cash prize and a modest The story thought about this for a little. This time I made sure that I knew what the plan was before I set out. Eventually I came to see that Last Night is a hard sell. It was too long, too dark, and arguably too sophisticated for an... As most writers do, I had been developing a few story ideas on the side. Stories? I didn't get very far with it, however, because at the time, Last Night had already spawned 2 novels. 2 sequels. And it'll be the book that I launch first and push the hardest on the market. It'll be the book that I launch the... It wasn't the first time that the idea of self-publishing had occurred to me, and I had even and I'm just rambling now. It's like having triplets 3 times. What happened with the Sylvan song? I guess I'm just a fan of what we like to call here in Montreal, le ménage à trois. That was a terrible trois. Le ménage à trois. This phenomenon has happened to me 3 times now. It's like having triplets. This brings me to my third trilogy. And the last book that I want to talk about, The Far Country. Here's again. Oh, The Far Country kind of came out of left field. I wasn't really expecting to write any At its heart, The Far Country is a fantasy story, masquerading as science fiction. Yeah, that's right. So for this reason, I have decided to coin a new term for its genre, calling it hyperfiction. I got so close. I remember when I was at the beginning of my writing career, I met an older gentleman when I was just at the beginning of my cocktail party. At the time, I stubbornly refuted this. I didn't want to put any stock in At the time, I didn't put much stock in astrology, and I wasn't shy. I started writing Last Night in 1998 when I was 18. Now, 20 years later, as I'm about to finish I can see that while I haven't been very lucky getting published in that span of time, it's going to be interesting to see how I fare once I set that aside and no longer have creative lighting. Together, the first 3 novels of my 3 trilogies will form a 3-pronged plan of action, which will be spearheaded by the best of the bunch, the Sylvan Song. This will form a 3-plong, and they form a Together, the first 3 novels of my 3 trilogies, Last Night, The Sylvan Song, and The Far Country, form... If you want to know more about... You can also check out my author's site by... The link is in the description below.